Our Around the World segment tonight, 6 days into the historic Iranian protests, and the mainstream media is still getting the story wrong. They're claiming the protests are about the economy and calling Iranian President Rouhani a moderate instead of telling the truth. So we will tell you the truth. With me now to do so, Principal at Trilogy Advisors, Jan Sitilides. John, hi, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Liz.
All right, John, I want to start with some of the lies that are being perpetuated by the mainstream media and those on the left, especially former Obama officials who think they know more than President Trump about Iran here. So first of all, the narrative that's coming from the left is that these protests are purely about the economy. They're purely about economic opportunity in Iran. And while that might be where they started, that's not really painting the true picture.
Well, let's talk about three objectives here on the part of the detractors that you mentioned here, Liz. One is, first of all, a built-in blame America first mentality on the part of the left and the center left in the United States, most of whom the media are members of. And their perspective is anything that is wrong in U.S.-Iranian relations must be the fault of the United States. And that's why they were so happy that President Obama basically gave away the store in trying to achieve this nuclear deal and unfortunately succeeding in 2015, which leads us to part number two, and that is protecting the Obama legacy of the nuclear deal and making sure that exposing the kind of oppressive, brutal police state that the Iranian regime really is doesn't embarrass the Obama legacy and those in administration who are out there criticizing President Trump today, which leads us to number three, and that is to deny President Trump any potential advantage here, whether it's political, whether it's moral, or potentially historic, if this might lead to some type of longer-term change in Iran.
Right, and I mean, I think that hits the nail right on the head. I don't know what else there is to add to that except for that the economic destitution the people are experiencing in Iran is because the regime in Iran uses money to fund terrorism instead of building schools and hospitals and other things necessary for good quality of life for the Iranian people. John, I want to show on the screen a tweet from President Trump here. He's talking about U.S. support of the Iranian protesters. He says, such respect for the people of Iran as they try to take back their corrupt government. You will see great support from the United States at the appropriate time. John, what does he mean by at the appropriate time?
Well, I think one of the concerns that we're seeing right now is we don't really know how the Iranian regime is going to respond. Remember, they didn't respond immediately, Liz, in 2009 when you had the Green Revolution and that first outpouring of a desire for human rights and for freedom on the part of the Iranian people that President Obama turned a very cold shoulder to, if not complete back to. Very, very unfortunate part of a recent American history. And so I think the degree to which the Iranian regime may crack down, who knows, tomorrow, in 5 days, in 5 weeks, and it could be a longer-term process, Liz, because what they do, and at least we learned this from 2009, is they begin to take photographs of everyone who's out in the streets, and after, hopefully, from their perspective, the protests subside. If not, there'll be a brutal crackdown. Then they go after not only those individuals that they photographed, but the family members and colleagues, and they torture them, and they imprison them. And they make sure that there's a lesson learned that the Iranian people are never to be out in the streets calling for freedom, denouncing billionaire ayatollahs, and the wealth and corruption that we've seen in Iran over the last 40 years.
Right, and that's just, it's so awful to think about. That, I mean, first of all, it's awful to think about that they actually shoot into the crowds as they did in 2009, killing people who dared to go out on the streets. But then they wait. They wait until the media attention has lifted. They wait until these protests aren't in the eye of the rest of the world before they go after these people. And liberals here at home won't support the protesters that are subject to this type of oppression. And I guess it brings me to this question. I mean, the people that are out on the streets, one of the big differences, I think, between these protests now in the end of 2017 and 2018 versus the ones in 2009 is these protesters are calling for democratic elections. They're not just calling for the supreme leader to be deposed and another one put in his place. They're calling for an election where they have a voice in who is governing them. Is there any chance that they will succeed here?
There is, but I don't know how small that percentage is, again, because of the nature of the regime, Liz. Keep in mind, this is more of a rural, broad, widespread rebellion than we saw in 2009 with mostly urban, sophisticated residents of Iranian cities. And it's all largely the result of, as you mentioned before, the economic issues. But the economic issues alone haven't done it. These problems with increases in fuel and food and tuition prices are really only angering the people because they just found out from a leak of the Iranian government budget a few weeks ago that billions of dollars are going for the mullahs, they're going for the military, they're going for the Revolutionary Guard Corps, that are the personal militia of the Ayatollahs and the supreme leader and his men, and for hardline organizations basically to feed a wealthy, corrupt machine in Iran at the expense of everyday rural citizens in Iran. And I think President Trump is going to look to see how this unfolds over the next few weeks and think seriously about reimposing sanctions based on human rights violations, on terrorism in the region and around the world, and on ballistic missile production that President Obama waived very misguidedly in pursuit of his nuclear deal.
Right. I mean, if I were a part of the Iranian people here, I'd be reading news stories about the pallets of cash that President Obama sent to the Iranians, and I'd be thinking, what did my government do with this money? Why am I still living in destitution? Why are they funding violence and death and hatred and radical ideology and terrorism all around the world, while me and my family are living in poverty, while we're denied hospitals and schools and basic necessities to live my life? Good for these people. And at what point in this process do you expect, or do you expect any other Western nations to join in here and not just tweet support, not just say support, not just write support, but actually provide material support and support a regime change, a dismantling of the Islamic theocracy that right now rules that land?
It's a very tragic situation that we face, Liz, and I'm so glad you asked that question. First of all, we would look to our European counterparts who uphold human rights, they say, as the cornerstone of so-called European Union foreign policy, and they've essentially issued a moral equivalent statement calling on violence on both sides to desist. So the clarion call for freedom on the part of the Iranian people is now equated with the brutal, oppressive crackdown by a police state against people who simply yearn for freedom and for liberty and the opportunity to craft their own lives. The Europeans have been, for the most part, shameless here, largely because they want to preserve the nuclear deal and they want to continue to access Iranian markets for major energy and other industrial types of deals. So we're not going to see any type of moral or political leadership from Europe, I'm afraid, in the foreseeable future, nor will you see anything meaningful coming out of the United Nations, largely because Russia is on the Security Council. Right now, tactically, it has Iran's back, and China also tends to support crackdowns whenever there are rebellious peoples to make sure their own people don't learn the wrong lesson. So the Security Council won't be doing anything meaningful at the UN, and the European Union right now is shamefully, morally equivalent on this issue.
Right, and I think the key word there is shameful. It's the response from the Western world, who supposedly supports freedom and liberty and justice for all, is absolutely shameful in their lack of support, their silence, their deafening silence on behalf of these protesters in Iran. John, thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your insight. We've got a good one for you next. Why isn't the Women's March taking to the streets in support of the women in Iran? The co-organizer of the Women's March is a Muslim herself. She comments constantly on Palestinian women. Why doesn't she care about Iranian women? When is enough with the hypocrisy coming from liberal feminists right here in the United States? When are they going to stop pretending that they champion women, since they quite obviously do not? Hit me up on Twitter at Liz_Wheeler over the break, and we'll see you back here in just a minute.